Okay, good afternoon, distinguished guests, faculty, and students. Welcome to the university lecture by Dr. Pachauri. My name is Vinay Aneja, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Marine, Earth, and Atmospheric Sciences, and also spend part of my time in the University Office of International Affairs. Before we get started, I want to recognize a few people. First, are there any members of the North Carolina General Assembly in attendance? Please rise and be recognized. Okay. Two, and you won't laugh at the second one. Are there any members of the UNC Board of Governors or members of the NCSU Board of Trustees in attendance? Please rise and be recognized. Thank you very much. We are really appreciative that you could come to this event, Mr. Nath. It is rare that you go home and tell your family or your wife that you had the honor and privilege of introducing a Nobel laureate. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed my delightful pleasure to introduce to you today an NC State alumnus, Dr. Rajendra Pachauri, who is the Chief Executive of the Energy and Resources Institute, sometimes called TERI, since 1992, serving initially as the director and since April of 2001 as the Director General. He also serves as the Chancellor of TERI University. A noted climate scientist, Dr. Pachauri has been active in several international forums dealing with climate change and its policy dimensions. In April of 2002, he was elected chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, sometimes called IPCC, which was established by the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Program. In 2007, Dr. Pachauri and his IPCC colleagues, along with former Vice President Al Gore, were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Last week, he was invited to address the heads of states on climate change at the UN Climate Change Summit in New York at the start of the UN General Assembly. His wide-ranging expertise has resulted in his membership of several international and national boards and committees, including Economic Advisory Council to India's Prime Minister, the Advisory Board of the Clinton Climate Initiative, the International Advisory Board of Toyota Motor Corporation, and several others. In 2009, he was appointed the first director of the Yale Climate and Energy Institute. He was also on the board of Global Humanitarian Forum, founded by the former UN General Secretary, Kofi Annan. In April of 1999, he was appointed member of the board of directors of the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies in Japan and continues to hold this appointment. Since 1992, he has been president of the Asian Energy Institute. He was president in 1988, and he was chairman in 1989, and then in 1990, of the International Association of Energy Economics. Among his many honors, in 2008, he was honored by the President of India by its prestigious Padma Vibhushan, India's second highest civilian honor for his services in the field of science and engineering. Pachauri was awarded the Government of France's Award in 2006. He also received Padma Bhushan from the President of India in 2001 for his immense contribution to environmental studies. Now the most important part. Dr. Pachauri received his MS and PhD degrees in industrial engineering as well as economics from NC State University. He also served as an assistant professor and visiting professor in NC State in the mid-1970s. He will share with us today the findings from the IPCC's fifth assessment report, which was published earlier this year. Let us all welcome Dr. Pachauri to his alma mater.
Thank you very much, Professor Aneja. It's always a moment of joy and enormous nostalgia to get back to NC State and to be among you all. This is a remarkable institution, and it gets better every time I come here. So it just gives you a deep sense of satisfaction that you are a part of this institution, which I owe a great deal to. And it's very difficult for me to put in words what I feel I have learned, what I have gained from being part of NC State. Professor Aneja exaggerated a lot when he introduced me, but I've been used to him. He's a guy who always exaggerates a lot of things. So those of you who are his students, better beware. When he tells you something, divide it at least 3 by 3, and you'll get it. No, it's a great privilege to be here, and I am trying very hard to see that my own institution, which is headquartered in India, and NC State can develop a professional relationship. As a matter of fact, for a start, Professor Aneja is planning a study abroad program for students who would come to my institution next year, hopefully. And in that, there's no exaggeration. He'll succeed. He'll do it. What I'm going to do is to present some of the findings of the fifth assessment report of the IPCC and to bring you up to date. 3 working group reports have been published as part of the fifth assessment cycle. And the final product, which is the synthesis report, is currently under finalization and should be ready by the end of October. And then the fifth assessment report would be complete in all respects. And what I'm going to present before you will show how we have advanced in our understanding of the climate and what the role of human society is in bringing about some of the changes that are taking place. So I'll start by showing you the first slide, which says that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, the word used over here is needs. And needs are very difficult to define. A billionaire may feel his needs are absolutely crucial and they have to be met. A poor man who doesn't know where his next meal is going to come from only wants the next meal. So there are huge areas where we have doubts on how this definition needs to be interpreted. Nevertheless, it gives you a framework. It gives you at least a philosophical definition of what sustainable development really means. And what it emphasizes to my mind is the fact that whatever we do, we should ensure that coming generations will not be left in a state of disadvantage as a result. And I think this also means that we have to look at intra-generational equity. I mean, whatever we do shouldn't really leave somebody else worse off. Now, that in economics is a well-defined proposition, but in real life, clearly it's very difficult to take actions that don't necessarily have impacts on others. In the case of the environment, we know that there is such a thing as negative externalities. When we carry out any production or consumption activity, it often has impacts on the environment, which are not accounted for, because often you don't pay for the damage that you cause on the environment. And this is particularly true of the global commons. What are the global commons? The air that we breathe, the water that flows through the rivers and is there in the oceans as well, and all the natural resources that essentially we derive services and benefits from, but don't necessarily pay for. And therefore, there's also the issue of who is accountable for maintaining those common resources or those global commons. There really is no clear accountability. And this is what a very bright biologist by the name of Garrett Hardin wrote about in the year 1968 when he referred to the tragedy of the commons. So I'll delve into these issues a little later, but let me move to the next slide. And this is to tell you about how the IPCC functions. We are an intergovernmental organization. We are not a UN organization. And often there are misperceptions on this score. But the way we work is by mobilizing the best scientists from all over the world. And they spend 3 to 4 years of their life working on the completion of a single report, as has been the case with the 5th assessment report. And this represents a huge volume of scientific effort carried out collectively and approved by all the governments of the world. The final summary for policymakers, which is part of every report, is something that is approved word by word by all the governments of the world. And this, of course, makes it very difficult. It's a huge challenge to get that summary for policymakers approved by all the governments, because they represent a very diverse set of interests and understanding of the issues. But the good news is that we're able to get this kind of agreement in the ultimate analysis, often after a lot of sweat and tears. But that's the way the world works. To tell you about the scale of the activity that we had in the 5th assessment report, the Working Group 1 report deals with the physical science basis of climate change. And the number of authors in this report were 259. They were drawn from 39 different countries. And I'd like to highlight another important feature. We carry out drafting of these reports in 4 different steps. And at each step, the drafts are subjected to expert review. The final draft goes to expert as well as government review. So we get comments on each of the drafts, and these comments have to be taken into account. There is an entity called a review editor whose job it is to see that every comment is taken on board. And the authors have to record whether they accept a comment, or if they don't accept it, they have to record reasons why they were not accepted. So, as you can see in the Working Group 1 report, we had roughly 55,000 comments. And I don't want to go into the amount of numerical data that was processed, 2 million gigabytes. And there were about 9,200 scientific publications which were cited in this report. So that's a pretty large volume of activity that, really speaking, the authors are not paid for at all. It's purely a labor of love. They do it because of the professional satisfaction and the prestige of being involved in an IPCC report. The Working Group 2 report, I'll run through this quickly, 309 authors from 70 countries, again over 50,000 comments, and over 12,000 scientific references were cited. The Working Group 3 report had 235 authors from 57 countries, about 38,000 comments that were received, and close to 10,000 references to literature were cited in this report. Now, based on these three working group reports, we are now preparing the synthesis report, which will be approved at the end of October in Copenhagen. And then, of course, as I said, the cycle will be completed. Let me go to the next slide. And here I'd like to mention that some of the findings that we came up with clearly include the following. Firstly, that 95% certainty exists that human influence has been the dominant cause of the observed warmings since the mid-20th century. So in other words, since the middle of the last century, whatever changes in climate have taken place have been largely the result of human actions. And since the 1950s, many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. Now here I want to clarify one point. You know, often it is said, look, okay, even if climate change is taking place, it's because of natural factors. See, today science has developed to a point where we run a large number of models, go back in time, look at temperatures that actually existed, let's say going back to the year 1900, and then we run those models, first with an input of changes that have taken place in solar activity. And these are now very carefully recorded, very carefully measured. So we run the models with the solar activity, and let's say if there's an eruption in a particular volcano, that's also included. And then we compare the results we get from those models with the actual observations that have been recorded. And you find there's a large deviation. Then you run the model, including the input of increase in the concentration of greenhouse gases, along with the input of the solar activity and volcanic activity that took place. And you get a perfect fit. In other words, the models are able to explain exactly how much warming has taken place because of natural factors and how much has taken place on account of human factors. So the point I'm trying to make is that we now know with a substantial amount of precision exactly what is happening to the climate of the Earth and to what extent one can attribute the changes that take place to nature and how much of it can be attributed to human actions. So since the 1950s, many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. So really speaking, in a short period of time, human society has changed the climate in a manner that has not changed for thousands of years. Also, human influence has been detected in warming of the atmosphere and the ocean, in changes in the global water cycle, in reductions in snow and ice, in global mean sea level rise, and in changes in some climate extremes, which I'll say a little bit about very soon. If I turn to the next slide, what you have over here, the upper diagram shows you change in global average upper ocean heat content. You see, as it happens, a large part of the heat which has been generated as a result of climate change since 1970 onwards, about 90% of it has gone into the oceans. And the oceans have now warmed to a depth of about 700 meters. And that warmth is now descending gradually to lower depths of the ocean as well. This has very serious implications for marine life and for marine ecosystems. The second diagram shows you global average sea level change. And why does sea level rise take place? Well, firstly, the amounts of snow and ice have diminished, and there's also thermal expansion of the oceans. Both of these factors lead to sea level rise. And of course, the concentration of greenhouse gases have increased. Now, let me tell you that sea level rise, since the beginning of the last century up through 2010, has been an average of 19 centimeters across the globe. And 19 centimeters is pretty close to a foot. So you can imagine those people who are living in low-lying areas are clearly threatened by any kind of weather event that may lead to storm surges or coastal flooding. Because the higher the level of the sea, the greater would be the extent of devastation that takes place. And I want to tell you that the insurance industry is very sensitive to this reality. A good friend of mine who's the chairman of a major company told me he has a house in the coastal area of Delaware, and he says he can't get insurance for that building anymore because the insurance companies clearly visualize the threat and the risk to insuring property of that nature. And again, not because it's likely to be submerged, but only because every time there's a major storm surge, that particular building could be affected adversely. Let me go to the next slide. This is just to tell you where all the emissions come from. The electricity sector accounts for about 25%. AFO-LU stands for agriculture, forestry and land use. That accounts for another 24%. Buildings are a source of emissions, transport and industry. On the right-hand side of that diagram, you have indirect emissions, because if you look at industry, for instance, it needs a lot of raw material. It has a supply chain. And along that supply chain also, there are emissions of greenhouse gases. So if you were to add both the indirect as well as the direct emissions, then you get a much more accurate picture of which sector accounts for how much of the emissions of greenhouse gases. I want to highlight some of the impacts of climate change, and what needs emphasis is the fact that climate change is not a smooth and steady increase in temperatures. It is much more than that. For instance, we brought out a special report in 2011 on extreme events and disasters, in which we highlighted and clearly assessed some of the extreme events that climate change is bringing about. And I'd like to give you some findings from there. It's very likely that the length, frequency, and/or intensity of warm spells or heat waves will increase over most land areas. In fact, under some scenarios, a 1 in 20-year hottest day is likely to become a 1 in 2-year event in most regions. And heat waves are on the increase. That means you would get extreme temperatures, possibly for short periods of time, but these would be far more than what has been the pattern in the past. Another major extreme event that's on the increase and will increase further in the future, both in frequency and intensity, would be heavy precipitation. So it's likely that the frequency of heavy precipitation or the proportion of total rainfall from heavy falls will increase over many areas of the globe. And often I'm asked, what do you think of Superstorm Sandy? Well, you can't attribute any single extreme event to human-induced climate change, because there's a whole range of other factors that might be bringing about. bringing it about. But it's absolutely unmistakable that the trend is clearly in the direction of higher frequency and intensity of these extreme events, and that they will increase over a period of time. So if you look at the sum total of these extreme events, wherever they occur, their frequency and their intensity, you can say without any doubt whatsoever that these are on the increase and will increase further in the future. Let me go to another set of findings. Sustained mass loss by ice sheets, some of which could be irreversible, would cause larger sea level rise. I've been to the Arctic region several times, and I've also been to Greenland, which incidentally is a huge mountain of ice, about 3 kilometers high. And when you look around, you see nothing but ice. And in fact, I went on a US Air Force plane, which didn't land on wheels, it landed on skis. And it couldn't take off simply because there had been fresh snow, and in that condition, the plane couldn't take off. So it had to wait for a while till all the ice solidified, and then it could take off. But the point I want to make is that this is a massive amount of ice that's stored over there. And if, as is the current indication, melting takes place and the mass of that ice reduces, then obviously it could lead to much faster sea level rise than we have seen in the past. So sustained warming greater than some threshold, which has to be greater than 1 degree Celsius, but less than about 4 degrees global mean warming with respect to the pre-industrial norm, would lead to near complete loss of the Greenland ice sheet over a millennium or more. So it's not going to happen today, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but over a few hundred years, this could vanish, and this could cause a global mean sea level rise of up to 7 meters. So that means the entire geography of the planet could be altered. Again, I'm not saying that this is something that will happen in our lifetimes, but we have to ensure that we prevent any possibility of such an occurrence, even in the future, even when it comes to talking about the future in distant terms. Some of the other impacts of climate change, projected negative impacts for production of wheat, rice, and maize, for local temperature increases of 2 degrees Celsius or more above the late 20th century levels without adaptation. This takes me to another concept which I think is absolutely crucial to managing the challenge of climate change, and that's adapting to climate change. Why? Simply because whatever we do today, even if we reduce emissions of greenhouse gases to zero, there would be a certain inertia in the system, as a result of which climate change will continue for a few decades. But the point to remember is that beyond a certain stage, adaptation alone will not work. We will have to mitigate the emissions of greenhouse gases, as a result of which we would be able to limit temperature increase and everything else that goes with it in the future. So if we look at impacts on food security, the projected negative impacts of production of wheat, rice, and maize have implications for food security. And the redistribution of marine fisheries catch potential poses risk of reduced supplies, income, and employment. A large part of the world relies on marine resources for getting its food, getting a large part of its proteins and other nutritional requirements, and that's going to change. I was mentioning in another meeting earlier today that the last time I went to the Maldives Islands a few years ago, they were complaining of the fact that tuna, which is the largest export commodity, is just not available anymore because there is migration of species. As the temperature of the oceans change, then clearly some fish species will move to other locations where they find the temperature more suitable for their own biological needs. So as a result, there will be redistribution of fish stock from one part of the world to the other as far as the oceans are concerned. Now, there are also impacts on human health. There's increased likelihood of injury, disease, and death due to more intense heat waves and fires, and that's been happening all over the world, and that's going to get more intense in the future. Undernutrition from diminished food production in poor regions, and risks from food and water and vector-borne diseases. With changes in the climate, there are certain vectors which would increase in terms of spread, in terms of their density, and therefore that's going to lead to an increase in vector-borne diseases. Now, climate change over the 21st century can increase displacement of people, particularly in developing countries with low income. And I might mention, purely by way of information, the defense establishment, even in the US, regards climate change as potentially a very serious security problem. Risks of violent conflicts by amplifying poverty and economic shocks. Because if you take an area which is already stressed in terms of resources, it could be water availability, or for that matter in terms of availability of food, then climate change will only exacerbate those conditions, as a result of which there is the possibility of violent conflict. And rivalry among states due to potential transboundary impacts of climate change, such as changes in sea ice, shared water resources, and pelagic fish stocks. This could lead to conflicts as well. So that's something to keep in mind. Then throughout the 21st century, climate change impacts are projected to slow down economic growth, make poverty reduction more difficult, further erode food security, and prolong existing and create new poverty traps, particularly in urban areas, and emerging hotspots of hunger. So let me just quickly go through some of the other impacts of climate change. The interactions among climate change mitigation, adaptation, and disaster risk management may have a major influence on resilient and sustainable pathways. So the point I'd like to make is when we plan strategies for growth and development in the future, we would necessarily have to incorporate the impacts of climate change and how we might be able to mitigate emissions of greenhouse gases. Because after all, the central task of any kind of economic strategy or policy is to see that the lives, particularly of the poorest of the poor, are improved so that we can lift them out of their current state of deprivation and poverty. The interactions between the goals of mitigation and adaptation will play out locally but have global consequences. I'd like to again explain that adaptation is something which is purely a local phenomenon, but mitigation has to be done on a global basis because the gases that we're talking about, greenhouse gases, mix freely in the atmosphere. Whether you reduce emissions in the US or Australia or Japan really doesn't make a difference. Or conversely, if you emit these gases anywhere on the globe, it still has the same effect because they are mixing freely across the globe. So we need to focus on adaptation as a local initiative where you've got to create local capacity by which the specific impacts of climate change can be handled and managed by the local population. But as far as mitigation is concerned, this has to be a global effort. And the truth is that there are already a number of stresses in the world, and climate change would only multiply these further. Africa's largest recorded cholera outbreak affected 90,000 people. Over 4,000 were killed, and it began following onset of seasonal rains, and vulnerability and exposure increased the risk. So what I want to emphasize is the fact that in a world which already has a number of stresses, climate change will only multiply and exacerbate those stresses. And this is of particular relevance to developing countries, because if you look at data for the period 1970 to 2008, data for all natural disaster-related deaths, and this is not only climate change, but all disasters, 95% of the deaths took place in developing countries. Why? Because often you don't have early warning systems. And even if you have early warning systems, people don't have the means by which they can go to places of safety. So they become victims of some of these disasters, and that leads to a very high incidence of death and disease. One important conclusion is, therefore, that climate-resilient pathways would combine adaptation and mitigation to reduce climate change and its impacts. Since mitigation reduces the rate and magnitude of warming, it also increases the time available for adaptation to a particular level of climate change, potentially by several decades. So if we mitigate the emissions of greenhouse gases, we're really buying additional time during which we can put in place adaptation measures, even adaptation infrastructure. If you look at a country like the Netherlands, about 25% of that nation is under sea level. And if you go back to the history of the Netherlands, there were actually 3 areas of land, and people wanted more land, so they said, okay, let's start recovering land from the sea, and the sea was quite shallow. So they started building dikes, they started building infrastructure by which they could keep the sea out, and they were thus able to expand the land area that's available to them. What are the Dutch doing today? Well, they are increasing the height of their dikes. They're increasing the thickness of their dikes, because they realize that with sea level rise, they would have to protect themselves against the ingress of the sea. But not every low-lying country in the world has the resources to do that. So there's a substantial dichotomy in that regard, and an enormous amount of disparity between the developed and developing countries. So therefore, it is crucial that we not only find ways by which we can adapt to the impacts of climate change, but also mitigate the emissions of greenhouse gases, so that those who are the worst affected will be able to live under conditions that give them sustainable development in the future. I'll run through this rather quickly. There are various strategies that can manage disaster risk now and also help improve people's livelihoods and well-being. The most effective strategies offer development benefits in the relatively near term and reduce vulnerability over the longer term. Because if you can protect lives and property against disaster, then you're also giving people an opportunity to develop. If you don't do that, then clearly disasters would make it absolutely impossible for people to follow any path of development. As a matter of fact, in several places, they would be slipping lower down the ladder of development. This is just a picture of how effective risk management and adaptation are tailored to local and regional needs and circumstances, because changes in climate extremes vary across regions, and each region has unique vulnerabilities and exposure to hazards. And therefore, effective risk management and adaptation address the factors contributing to exposure and vulnerability. You've got to get to the depth of what is causing this kind of exposure to risk and vulnerability. I'll quickly talk about some of the adaptation measures that are required. Freshwater resources are going to be affected across the globe. So we need adaptive water management techniques, learning-based approaches, and flexible and low-regret solutions. What are low-regret solutions? Well, one of them is early warning systems. You know, in a large part of the world, and I've been responsible for looking into one particular case, In India, in the southeast part of India, there was a terrible heat wave in the year 2003, and I was asked to chair a committee to look into it. What was appalling was the fact that everybody listened to the radio, everybody watched television, but these media were not used to warn the people that a heat wave was on and how they should react to it. Simple things like oral rehydration therapy. Now, if we were to institute some of these measures, then clearly lives would be saved. People's distress would be minimized. So these are low regrets measures, and I think we need to put them in place to be able to reduce the risk to life and property. Rural areas, terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, key economic sectors and services, and urban areas are particularly vulnerable because in urban areas you also have what is known as the urban heat island effect. So on top of that, if you have climate change related heat waves, then clearly people are going to be that much more vulnerable. And human health, with the impacts of climate change, you would have to gear up and strengthen some of the basic public health services. Now let me go to what needs to be done in terms of dealing with this problem and by mitigating emissions of greenhouse gases. Here, let me show you, if you take the topmost line, the line on top, that gives you economic growth without mitigation. The lower line gives you economic growth with mitigation at a rate by which we would be able to limit temperature increase by the end of the century to below 2 degrees Celsius. And the cost of this, if you were to measure just the direct cost, would be no more than 1.7% of the global GDP in 2030. Now, apart from this, there are also a number of co-benefits from mitigating emissions of greenhouse gases. And how would we bring this about? And let me show you with some degree of detail what this would involve. Well, firstly, we'll need lower global GHGs in 2050 than in 2010. They'll have to be 40 to 70% lower. Emissions level near 0 gigatons of CO2 equivalent or below by the year 2100. So by the year 2100, the world will have to emit 0 greenhouse gases or actually negative greenhouse gases. How do we do that? Well, if you look at a simple option like forestry, we'll have to halt deforestation, we'll have to expand forestry area, we'll have to come up with technologies like carbon capture and storage, there'll have to be a large amount of bio energy that would have to be produced, and possibly nuclear and large-scale use of renewable sources of energy. So this is something that is feasible, but one point that I'd like to emphasize is the importance of carbon capture and storage. Now, this technology has not been developed. There is research and development going on in several companies with CCS, but we'll have to accelerate our efforts to see that it becomes commercially viable well before the end of the century. Basically, we'll also have to bring about major improvements in energy efficiency and a tripling to nearly quadrupling of the share of energy supply from renewables by 2050. And that will only happen if we put in place policies today by which the private sector starts investing in R&D, governments start investing in R&D, so that we can bring about a major shift to renewables by the middle of this century. Let me just talk quickly about some of the sectors in which mitigation potential exists. Energy supply, whether it's fossil fuel energy that's converted into liquid fuels, or coal, which is used for power generation. Industry has enormous potential. Transport, agriculture, forestry and land use, buildings, human settlements and infrastructure, and spatial planning. Now, the good news is that in a number of applications, renewable energy is already reaching the point where it's commercially viable. This diagram tells you about specific options for producing renewable energy in specific applications. And the band that you see on the left gives you the range of costs of conventional sources of energy supply. And the bars that you see over here give you the range of costs with renewable sources of energy. So certainly, biomass electricity is economically viable, as you would see. Wind electricity is economically viable. So also geothermal heat, and so on. So wherever you have potential for some of these renewable energy opportunities, we need to exploit them as quickly and adequately as possible. There are, as I mentioned earlier, enormous co-benefits from mitigation actions. Improved energy efficiency and security. Energy security would improve if we reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. We would have cleaner energy sources. Air quality and human health would benefit. Reduced energy and water consumption in urban areas. Sustainable agriculture and forestry. Protection of ecosystems for carbon storage. So if you were to add up all these co-benefits, then the cost of mitigation becomes that much lower. And therefore, if you also combine that with the benefits of avoided impacts of climate change, then clearly what we are talking about is win-win opportunities. I'll now turn to the last slide that I wanted to show. A stable climate is one component of sustainable development. You really can't have sustainable development if the climate system is playing games with you all the time. So what you need is a stable climate system. Limiting the effects of climate change is necessary to achieve sustainable development and equity, including poverty eradication. And designing an effective climate policy involves mainstreaming climate in the design of sustainable development strategies. Options for equitable burden sharing can reduce the potential for costs of climate action to constrain development. Because, there are huge economies of scale. If all the countries of the world were to work together towards implementing some of these solutions, then clearly costs would come down significantly. And here, let me talk about someone who I had a great deal of regard for in the field of economics. He talked about the term bioeconomics. He said the term is intended to make us bear in mind continuously the biological origin of the economic process and thus spotlight the problem of mankind's existence with a limited store of accessible resources, unevenly located and unequally appropriated. And what we really need is to keep in mind two other important quotes that I'd like to place before you. A technological society, which is what Gandhi said, has two choices. First, it can wait until catastrophic failures expose systemic deficiencies, distortion, and self-deceptions. Secondly, a culture can provide social checks and balances to correct for systemic distortion prior to catastrophic failures. Now, basically, what this says is that we have knowledge of some of the risks that we might be facing in the future, and it's not necessary for us to prove out those risks, because with the knowledge that we have available, we can embark on a pathway by which we can avoid those risks. And the best part of it is that the pathway that we can adopt and should adopt will be one which really provides us with win-win opportunities. It's not going to be costly. It's certainly going to require some adjustments. It would require some institutional changes and a set of policies, whether it's a case of a carbon tax or regulatory measures by which we bring about a shift. But this is something which is well within the means and capability of human society. And Here, let me also point out that it's absolutely critical that we start coming up with metrics that measure human progress for what it should really represent. If, let us say, we have a path of development which is going to impose major impacts on the environment and our natural resources, then clearly that should be taken into account in the measurement of GDP. And it was with this in mind that Mahatma Gandhi said, speed is irrelevant if you're going in the wrong direction. And therefore, let's correct our direction and see that we deal with climate change effectively. The last point I would like to make is that I think institutions like NC State and centers of learning and knowledge really have an enormous role to play in bringing about the spread of information, the spread of knowledge, whereby society understands the challenges that we face, and we all collectively can work together to create a better future. Thank you very much.
Okay, Dr. Pachauri has graciously agreed to take a few questions. So at this time, I will open the floor for questioning. And this is how I will do it, since I'm moderating. I will request a student to ask a question, a faculty member to ask a question, and a person from outside the campus to ask a question, so everybody gets equity in this process. So that being said, Dr. Larry Nielsen, you raised your hand, a faculty member. So wait a minute, there is another request, which is, can we get a microphone, please? Yeah.
And may I say, if the question is simple enough, I'll answer it. Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Dr. Anija.
That's assuming I'm a climate scientist.
Thanks for a wonderful presentation. You spoke to the General Assembly of the United Nations earlier. What was the reception there to the information you were giving?
Well, that was a very positive experience, may I say. And, you know, I spoke in the opening session, which was opened by the Secretary General of the UN, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, then the Mayor of New York spoke, and then I spoke. And this was followed by Mr. Al Gore and Chinese actress. And then came Mr. Leonardo DiCaprio. Now, I've learned an important lesson from two experiences. In the year 2008, I got an honorary doctorate at Yale. And who else got an honorary doctorate with me that year? Well, Sir Paul McCartney. So as we were going along in that procession, nobody noticed me. And everybody said, Sir Paul, Sir Paul. And I'm afraid a little bit of that happened with Leonardo DiCaprio also. So that's an important lesson, not to share the stage with celebrities. But on a more serious note, I think it was a remarkable event, simply because you had about 120 heads of state and heads of government. And the fact that they were there to talk about climate change shows at least a certain level of interest in the issue. And I think some of them also came up with very positive statements. It would have been wrong to expect that they would come there and make commitments, because that's going to take place under the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the process that's being pursued under it. But I would say that the message was received very well, and people with a single voice said that we have to do something about climate change. So let's hope some action follows as a result.
Somebody from the student body? Yes, sir?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Pachauri, for the wonderful presentation. I'm Brian, so I'm a senior here at NC State studying Business and International Studies. And I just had one question. You referred to the goals in terms of reaching a zero addition to the greenhouse gases by 2100. And it would be only achievable if certain policies and instruments are employed now. So since we have the fifth assessment from the IPCC that is approved by all governments, so what are the collective strategies in terms of integrated mitigation by all the governments and also localized adaptation measures that are taking place?
I think that's a very good question. But you know, there are lots of imponderables. At the moment, to be quite honest, the jury is still out whether we will get the kind of action on a global basis that would be required. I think there's clearly a huge spread of awareness all around and an acceptance of the need to take action on the part of most world leaders. The good news is that there's much happening also at the local level. You know, there are towns and cities, mayors who have made commitments. 2 weeks ago, I was in California with Governor Jerry Brown and the former Governor Schwarzenegger. And Governor Jerry Brown made a very important point. He said, California in the past 3 or 4 years has grown faster than the rest of the country, and our energy consumption has actually gone down. So the point he was making is that you can do it. You can do it while you bring about growth. And frankly, we need positive examples at the level of cities and towns, as well as states and provinces across the globe, by which people are convinced that the actions that are required to be taken are within their reach, and it's not going to lead to massive loss of jobs or economic output and employment. But to answer your question, I'm not too sure what's going to happen. My hope is that people will be driven by knowledge, will be driven by the reality of climate change and the need to implement some of the measures that I tried to outline. I remain optimistic. There's going to be a conference of parties in Lima this December, and next year is the crucial conference of parties in Paris, where it's hoped that a global agreement will be reached. Let's see what kind of progress we make.
Yes, sir. Wait a minute. Yeah. And after this, I'll open it to the entire floor. Whoever wants to ask the question, please go for it.
So I'm from outside, Dale Everts with Climate and International Group with EPA. Question about India. New government in place, lots of talk about climate change, its impacts on India. What's your sense of the direction the government will take, both long-term in terms of new either local or national initiatives addressing the sources of and mitigating and adapting to climate change, but also more specifically in dealing with the upcoming UN Framework Convention discussions?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And frankly, my institute and I have been trying to impress on the new government and its ministers that we need to worry about the issue of energy security. You see, in India's dependence on imports of energy are reaching a level where clearly security issues of various kinds do arise. And we've done a lot of modeling and projections for the future. And just to give you a number, if we continue with business as usual, then by 2031-32, we would be requiring to import about 900 million tons of coal. And that, frankly, is not going to be physically possible. Where would we get it from? And to set up all the port handling facilities, the infrastructure for inland movement and so on, imposes huge costs and certainly poses some questions of security. So this is something we've been trying to impress on the government of India. My own perception is that you'll see a large increase in solar energy capacity being added. And the Prime Minister himself has a record in his own state. He promoted solar energy in a big way. In fact, all the irrigation canals were covered with photovoltaic panels. And the benefits of that are, firstly, the government doesn't have to buy land. So land acquisition is not a problem. Secondly, you reduce evaporation. So that's an additional benefit. The third benefit is that with lower temperatures, those panels perform much better at high efficiencies. Otherwise, you would lose a percentage point or two in terms of efficiency of operation. And fourthly, around those canals, you've got a large number of farmers and so on. They get easy access to electricity for their homes. So I have a strong feeling that the government of India is going to go in for solar energy in a big way. On how they're going to posture in the upcoming negotiations, I really don't know. I've been trying to tell them that India has to lead. India has to become a model for the rest of the world. But you know, these issues become politically very complex because the stand of most developing countries is that the problem was not caused by us. Why put the burden on us? You guys have to take the first steps to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. So let's see. I think in Lima we will find out whether there's any shift in the position of India, or are they going to continue on the same path?
Great.
Dr. Pachauri, thank you for your talk. I'm Chris Frey, a professor of environmental engineering here, but I have an economics question for you. I was very intrigued by the graph you showed of global GDP with and without mitigation, I think is what you were comparing, and you showed 1 or 2 to 4% cost of mitigation, if I understood that correctly. But I'm wondering if you could comment on, does that graph take into account damage costs from climate? And as given your economics background, could you comment on at what point would it be reasonable to start looking at things like benefit cost analyses for climate? And I think some people are looking at externality costs for greenhouse gases, but maybe that's based more on control costs than damage. But I think one thing that might convince some policymakers who seem immune to the science would be the economics. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Well, I think that again is a very relevant question, because from the point of view of policy, you need to understand what the costs of taking action are and the costs of inaction. Now, the only problem with that is when it comes to impacts, it's very difficult to monetize impacts in precise terms, because there are non-economic aspects of impacts that are very difficult to estimate. I mean, loss of biodiversity, for instance. How does one convert that into a dollar figure? Or for that matter, there's a loss of ecosystem services. There are also deaths associated with the impacts of climate change. Loss of tradition and culture. You know, some people say, why not move all the residents of the small island states to safer locations far away? They're just a few thousand people. But, you know, there's also a certain culture that would perish then. Should we not associate a value with that? So it becomes very difficult to come up with a set of numbers that can be put forward with facility to make this comparison. To the extent we can, yes, we have tried in the 5th assessment report to come up with some costs of adaptation. But to be honest, that's not a complete assessment. And I think, quite apart from the economic aspects, people will also have to accept some of the human dimensions of the problem. And I think it's only when you get a comprehensive view of what we are doing to society by allowing business as usual that you might get a shift in the right direction. Okay, sure.
Well, thank you very much, and I think we do need to stop because he has another engagement that's coming up. But before we do, I have one last obligation on behalf of the Chancellor. Could I ask Mr. Harinath to please come to the podium? Up is it here? So on behalf of the university and on behalf of the Chancellor, there is a gift that I'm asking member UNC Board of Directors, Mr. Harinath, to please give it to Dr. Pachauri for the wonderful presentation.
I'm trying to see what it is.
He's your
It is safe, I can tell you that.
All right.
Congratulations.
Thank you, sir.
Wonderful speech.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I shall treasure this like I treasure everything else inside me that NC State has given me. Thank you very much.